Okay, so let's dive right in. You know, in the grand library of world literature, some of the most radical rebels aren't the ones you'd expect. They're not always shouting from the rooftops. Sometimes they're whispering jokes from the kitchen. Today, we're going to pull a forgotten genius off the shelf, a man who believed that the most profound truths weren't hiding in some sacred text, but were sitting right there on a dinner plate.
We are macaroni in the stew pot of gnosis. Yeah, gnosis, as in that deep, mystical inner knowledge. What in the world could that possibly mean? It sounds like something out of a surrealist painting, right? But believe it or not, this line is actually a piece of razor-sharp political satire from 600 years ago. And, well, it tells us pretty much everything we need to know about its author.
So the big question is, who was this man? A poet who secretly dreamed of being a chef, or maybe a chef who just so happened to be a brilliant poet? The answer, as it turns out, is a bit of both. And that very unique combination is exactly what made him one of the most clever and frankly dangerous social critics of his time.
So let's meet him. This is Ishaq At'ima, though he's much better known by his nickname, Bushaq. And that name literally means the food poet, or as the Germans who rediscovered him later called him, the Speisedichter. His entire philosophy, his art, his whole critique of the world, it all came down to one thing: food.
Now you gotta understand, in an era that was dominated by these epic poems about heroes and mystical verses about divine love, Bushaq did something totally unheard of. He took the high, refined art of Persian poetry and just dragged it right into the noisy, messy, and absolutely delicious world of the kitchen. For him, recipes revealed reality.
All right, so before we dig into the main course, we really need to set the table properly. It is so crucial to know exactly who we're talking about because our food poet has been mistaken for some other, let's just say, much more serious figures throughout history.
Yeah, the name Abu Ishaq, it pops up a lot. It's kind of like trying to find a specific John Smith in English history. You've got a theologian, a famous jurist, even a revered Sufi saint. But our Abu Ishaq? Nope, he wasn't any of those guys. He was the one who cared a whole lot more about stew than scripture. And look, this chart just clears up all that confusion instantly. While these other prominent Abu Ishaqs were defining religious law and mystical paths centuries earlier, our guy is planted firmly in the 15th century in the city of Shiraz. And his discipline? Not theology, gastro-satire. He wasn't trying to build a spiritual system, he was busy deconstructing the society around him, one dish at a time.
And his timing is absolutely key here. He wasn't living in some peaceful, stable golden age. He lived during the Timurid era, which was this period of intense cultural rebuilding right after the devastating conquests of Tamerlane. So it was a time of immense social chaos, inequality, and hypocrisy. I mean, the perfect ingredients for a master satirist.
So how did he do it? How did he manage to critique the powerful without, well, getting his head chopped off? He mastered a literary technique that was as brilliant as it was risky. It was an art form that acted as both his sword and his shield. He used a form of parody called Naqira. The technique itself is pretty simple, but boy, is it devastating. You take a famous, beloved, often sacred poem, and you just swap out its most important words. You keep the melody, but you completely flip the meaning, turning the sacred into the profane, the spiritual into the very, very material. And he put this to devastating use. For instance, there was this famous Sufi master who wrote about finding enlightenment in the Tavern of Love by drinking the wine of knowledge. Beautiful spiritual metaphor, right? Well, Bushaq takes it and just flattens it into the stew pot of gnosis, where you don't find wisdom, you find macaroni. His message was loud and clear. While you're all talking about enlightenment, I'm just trying to get a decent meal.
And he does it again and again. The Simurgh, this mythical, legendary bird that symbolizes the soul's quest for God? In Bushaq's world, you don't find it by meditating. Nope. You find it on the hills where the fat-tailed sheep graze, the source of a really good kebab. He was systematically tearing down the lofty language of the elite to expose what he saw as their total hypocrisy.
But why was he doing this? I mean, it wasn't just for a few laughs. For Bushaq, the kitchen was basically a laboratory for social analysis. He truly believed the entire structure of society, from the prince all the way down to the pauper, could be understood just by looking at what was on their plates.
And this brings us right to his central thesis, his big idea. Bushaq created a culinary map of power. He argued that social status wasn't just reflected in food, it was food. The powerful were these rich, heavy dishes, while the poor were simple, cheap ingredients. Your place in the world was literally defined by your place on the menu.
This table just lays it all out so perfectly. The ruling elite, they're roasted meats, exclusive, heavy, a symbol of conquest and raw power. The clergy, they're the sauces. They kind of cover everything up and can be a little deceiving. The people, macaroni, shapeless, and they just take on the flavor of whatever pot they get thrown into. And the poor, ouch, they're dry cheese, minimal, hard, just enough to get by.
When he described the food of the elite, he went all out. He talks about these epic feasts with a whole roasted horse, head and all. This wasn't just about being rich. It was a symbol of the nomadic, military culture of the Timurid rulers. It was a feast of pure, decadent, and totally intimidating power.
And then the contrast with the common people is just so stark. He calls them reshte, a type of noodle, a soggy mess. And just think about that for a second. Noodles are cheap, they have no real shape of their own, and they absorb the flavor of whatever sauce or broth they're cooked in. For Bushaq, this was the perfect, if a little brutal, metaphor for the masses, easily manipulated and totally dependent on the whims of their rulers.
But, okay, beyond all these brilliant and hilarious insults, why should we care about a 600-year-old food poet? Because his work served up something far more lasting than a good meal. What he was doing was a powerful cultural and political act.
Well, first off, he became an accidental historian. Because he wrote about everyday food, his poems are one of our only complete archives of 15th century Persian cuisine and language. Second, he perfected this incredible form of literary resistance, using humor as a shield to make critiques that would have been impossible to say out loud otherwise. And maybe most importantly, his social critique is timeless. He exposed that absurd gap between a ruling class obsessed with abstract ideals and the simple physical needs of the people they ruled.
And that leaves us with a final thought, something to chew on. Bushaq's great insight was that you can understand power by listening to how people talk about food. And 6 centuries later, we still do the exact same thing. We talk about the upper crust, bringing home the bacon, or spilling the tea. It really makes you wonder, what would a modern Bushaq see on our society's menu today? What does our food say about us?